David Clendon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's been interesting to see the uniform responses from opposition members about the primary content of this part, which of course is clause 3, the purpose statement. So what purports to be a purpose here, stated as being obtain information from returning offenders, establish release conditions for offenders returning to New Zealand. That is not a statement of purpose. That is a description of a mechanism for achieving a purpose or a range of purposes. It's a remarkably monocular view. And I understand how it emerges. You get too close to a document and you don't get the distance from it to realise the gaps in it. This is the value of a multi-party, multi-stakeholder development of policy, which this patently was not. The Minister put up some defence of this purpose statement, saying, well, those matters about support that we've all heard referred to already are being dealt with elsewhere. MSD was mentioned, various other agencies. What I don't see in here is any legislative framework that provides incentives for returning offenders to cooperate, to actively participate in their own rehabilitation and reintegration. And that is what is fundamentally missing. And the clues were actually there. The officials, I think, did a very good job of steering towards what could have been a much more balanced and a much more useful and helpful piece of legislation. We've heard reference already to this little table, this matrix of options and the strengths and weaknesses. The enhanced support service was seen as being poor in terms of public safety. And I agree that standing on its own, a voluntary system of, yep, I'll turn up and I'll go along with some of these support services, in itself, that wouldn't have been sufficient to assure public safety or to contribute to making our community safer. But I do argue that a set of enhanced support services wrapped around these people is necessary to achieve the outcomes, the real purpose, which is actually to make our community safer, to endeavour to ensure that these people do not reoffend, to improve the likelihood of them reintegrating, ultimately becoming useful and productive members of our society. I say the officials did a very, very good job of that. They noted, as in passing, that the enhanced support service option mechanism scored very well in terms of cost effectiveness. A little bit of money spent well will go a very long way to reducing the likelihood of ending up with these people back in jail at the cost of $100,000 per year simply to accommodate them in jail, putting aside the social cost of offending, the cost of prosecution, the court process and the like. I mentioned that I believe the officials have done some good thinking here. And I reference particularly paragraph 33 of the RIS, where they talk about the option being partially based or potentially based on a refugee resettlement model. And I think that's a really interesting idea. I think that's a very constructive idea. The idea that these people will come along, they'll simply plug into WINS, to MSD, to the various other existing services, overlooks the fact that these are a unique class of people. These are people who might feel very little connection to New Zealand. We've heard already evidence of individuals who left the country as infants, barely children, and now they're returning as adults, and unwillingly at that. They may not necessarily want to be part of New Zealand. They are a unique group of people, and I think this notion of treating them more in the way we treat refugees, for example, the notion of an orientation program, making it attractive, giving these people some incentive to participate actively in a reorientation, to say, okay, guys and girls, you're here, this is it, you're back here for now, let's make the best of it. Let's help you get your bearings in this, to what to many of them is actually a new community, a new culture, albeit not vastly dissimilar from where they've been, but certainly with some substantial significant differences. Focusing on information needed to help people live in New Zealand who haven't lived here perhaps since they were infants, have no memory of it. The idea of completing physical and mental health checks to assess their settlement needs. Now we can impose, we'll come to this later in a later part of this, but it talks about the possibility of establishing either under the standard conditions or special conditions, which, Mr Chair.
David Clinton.
And we can impose conditions one way or the other that requires people to go through a needs assessment. And that's okay. Yes, we're demanding that they must, which immediately can create a level of opposition. We know people who have lifelong experience of disguising illiteracy, low levels of educational achievement, alcohol or drug dependency. Those people get pretty good at hiding those realities. If we could get people involved in a much more cooperative approach, something along the lines of this proposed settlement, refugee resettlement, where these people can become active participants in their own reintegration. I see nothing in this legislation that's going to encourage or incentivise or even, frankly, oblige these people to do that. The notion, the point, as I say, has been made very clearly that these offenders will face very similar challenges to those that are facing refugees to come to this country, who come to this country in a sense unwillingly, very pleased, I dare say, to leave where they're coming from. Perhaps this wasn't their first choice. The fact is there is a sense of voluntarism, if you like, which will be absent from these people who have been returned against their will. So I do think we've missed a considerable opportunity there to legislate, to do the right thing by these people. The mention of cost has been made, about $2,000 per person. That doesn't sit very well. The only significant, if you could call it that, resource that the government has put to date was the $100,000 odd which has been given to PARS in Auckland in order to assist them to at least meet and make some effort to settle these people. The fact is they've been doing that work at least since the early months of this year. March, April, I know for sure they were doing that, and that $100,000 has to last them until June next year. That's more than 12 months. That's spreading that $100,000 extremely thinly, even using this quite modest notion of $2,000 per person, given the numbers we're likely to see. This is, as I say, and I've come back to the point that some of the provisions of this legislation are necessary, but they are simply not sufficient. And for that reason, we cannot offer support to it.